I'm Luke Story. For the past 22 years, I've been relentlessly committed to my deepest passion, designing the ultimate lifestyle based on the most powerful principles of spirituality, health, psychology, and personal development. The Lifestylist Podcast is a show dedicated to sharing my discoveries and the experts behind them with you. Jamie Wheal, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you today. There is almost too much to talk about. That is my fear.
100%.
Largely because you're a very broad thinker and a big thinker, creative thinker. I like to think that to some degree I share that quality with you. And I got to say, I've been just completely consumed by your most recent book, Recapture the Rapture. As I was telling you pre-interview, I did an experiment wherein I started the audiobook at about 1.5 speed and read along with the physical, hard copy of the book, and then got pretty good at that. And because I wanted to take notes. Because if I listen to an audiobook, I want to talk to him about that, then I forget. Or I'm in the car and, I'm going to run off the road trying to take a note. Then I bumped it up to 2. Then eventually today, when I was getting the last chapter in, I ended up on like 2.5.
Holy moly.
Yeah, which was really an interesting way to take in a book, but it did help me actually get the gist of the whole thing and be able to parse out what I think might be attainable in terms of a conversation.
Yeah.
Before we start, I want to just say, budding writer to established successful writer, your writing is insanely good. I mean, it's just, there are literally dozens of sentences where I'm just like, that's fucking good.
Oh.
I mean, just a sentence. A paragraph, great, but I mean, just so many brilliant word plays. So it was really inspiring to me just from a writing perspective of setting the bar. And I had to resist, the sort of the the downside of comparison, because quarter of the way through, I'm like, Luke, why do you even bother? You know what I mean? That compare and despair thing.
Oh,
because
I've never heard that. That's neat.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you're a guitar player, right? Oh, I'm going to play guitar, and then you listen to Jimi Hendrix. It's kind of like, well, why? And I had that feeling, but I'm going to get over it. I will use it as inspiration and not despair. What's the most exciting thing going on in your life right now?
I mean, I think the thing I'm sort of most curious about is almost the sort of answer to the question that this book, Recapture the Rapture, tees up, which is if we are in a meaning crisis and our old forms of meaning are collapsing under the weight of our reality, then what is a new way forward, sort of a meaning 3.0? And so for me right now, I am super geeked on kind of all things big history, literally like not even just, American history or the last few centuries or 1,000 years even, but just sort of more like literally what is the evolution and direction, or what is the direction of evolution? Question, is there one, right? And what is the teleological thrust or sort of story with a point and an ending of the human experience or consciousness in the universe or even consciousness on this planet? And combining everything from geology and evolutionary biology, literally origins of life. Are they in thermal vents in the oceans, or are they in these hot springs, in the deserts? And like, how did that happen? And what is the driving force of life? And what is the driving force of emergent consciousness? And how can we understand the human experience within that bigger arc, such that fundamentally we have a story that can provide us with hope and direction and consolation and motivation that could survive even the collapse of our civilization, right?
Oh.
So that's what I'm reverse engineering for. I'm like, what is a story that actually places us in the arc of something that matters, a plot we are participants in, and what would give us a sense of, back to sort of the unfolding of consciousness through the eons on this earth, whether or not our current expression of culture persists indefinitely. Because if that crashes, right, most people's stories are out of luck. Yeah, so what is an anti-fragile mythopoetics for the apocalypse? That's what I'm geeking on right now.
Okay, that's great. I was, not that I was expecting this answer, but one could answer like, I'm really into baseball lately. My team's ahead this season, and I'm stoked. Got a new barbecue.
I mean, I know I'm a little late to the whole Pokemon Go thing, but it's just firing me up.
Oh, that's hilarious, man. That's very cool. Well, that sets the perfect premise of this chat, really, right? Is to just completely compress your book down into its the sum of its parts is kind of where are we, where have we been, where do we want to go, and how are we going to get there? Which you've given us. If anyone just took a few of the tools in this book, and I'm sure many people listening are already practicing many of the things that you talk about in terms of consciousness expansion, and then as we are able to support ourselves and evolve as individuals, that we might come together in mutually supportive and healthy ways. I'm sure many people are doing that, but what a daunting task just to get your own shit together, to get your own house in order is no small feat. I'm aware of it. I'm in the process of doing that myself for all of these years. And, it's a fun process. But then how do we actually come together and support each other in doing so without ultimately creating a cult, that is exploitive of the people that it intended to serve in the first place. But anyway, I want to set a little bit of a framework. So, no, I don't. Actually, the first thing I want to ask you is tell me about this. I'm a hot springs junkie. That's my number one favorite thing in the world.
Oh, fantastic.
Is soaking in hot springs. And at one point in the book, it's totally related to a much deeper story, but you talk about being, up in the Himalayas or something in Tibet and soaking in a hot spring, finding that it was full of snakes. And I was like, please just tell me what happened with
Absolutely unfucking real. So we hike into like 17,000 feet to this little tantric monastery that was so high up the Chinese had missed it. So it was intact from the Cultural Revolution and their annexation of Tibet. And at the same time, it was this nunnery over these mountains from the sort of neighboring monastery. And they were doing sky burials when we got there. So picture this incredible, literally like Yosemite times 10 as far as scale. It was just fucking monstrous with this huge alpine river pouring out of these sheer granite faces. And then going past these flat-toothed, kind of like Patala Palace style Tibetan structures, which was the nunnery, and then straight through this rock wall, boom. The whole thing just punches straight through the mountain. Their story is Padmasambhava magicked it. That's how it happened, because that's not how erosion works, right? The river just goes through a hole in the side of the mountain. And right next to that spot with this huge churning white water are these amazing hot springs. So we get there after busting ass for days, right? And we finally get up there and we're like, oh my gosh, it's afternoon, it's nearly sunset. We're gonna rock this. This is gonna be a peak moment for sure. We're gonna nail this. We get on our trunks, right? We go tiptoeing down to the river. We hop in, and then the sun's setting, and we're like, "This is the life," winning. And then one of our students looks down and screams bloody murder, and she's like, "There's a snake around my leg," and we're like, "Whatever, girl, you are tripping. This is elevation sickness. Whatever. We're gonna play through." And then she keeps wigging, and then we just suddenly look around, and in the fading light, right, the stone wall around us is just pulsing. And we're like, what the fuck? And then we zero in on it. And it's all this, it's like 6 to 9 inches of snake heads cantilevered out from the rocks, all weaving and looking at us. And it was absolutely horrific. I have a mortal fear of snakes of any stripe. I scream
do?
I scream like a schoolgirl if one crosses my path. My kids bust my balls all day long on this. So to see that while we're sitting there in the water was just absolutely over the top. And we never went back.
And I'm assuming in the book you stated that ended up they weren't poisonous, but you don't know that in the moment, right?
No, in the moment you're just like, this just is wigging out every little monkey bone in my body.
Yeah,
and I'm out of here.
And it's so unexpected too. We were talking about Colorado where you've lived, and I've lived as well. And I was always disappointed because snakes were really hard to come by there at that altitude. They weren't that common. When I was a kid in California, my main pastime for a number of years was catching snakes. And so if I was at 17,000 feet, I would be even less expectant of snakes appearing, let alone in a freaking hot spring.
Yeah, it was outstanding.
I've never seen you see those on National Geographic channel and stuff. You see the hot spring monkeys, but I've never seen any animals come near hot springs ever. And I've been in, I don't know, dozens, if not 100 or more of them, I'd say, over my life. So yeah, I had to just get more insight on that. Let's begin by defining rapture briefly, being kind of the premise of your book. If we're going to recapture this, what's your definition of it?
Yeah, I think there's two, and it's really important to kind of tease them apart, right? So, on the capital R rapture, what we're thinking of is typically the kind of some form of end of time story, closely identified with the Christian evangelical movement in America. There was a series of books left behind that then blew up this notion that, at some point in the future, quite near future possibly, all the saved or blessed will be beamed up to the mothership, and then all the folks, the leftovers, which was that HBO show, will be left behind, right? So that's the idea of the Christian evangelical rapture. There are lots of others around the world of some form of end time and deliverance, but that's a very specific one, and it has implications for everybody, non-believers and believers, because it's strongly influencing American geopolitics, right? So there's a very strong element of Christian belief, and Martin Luther King was also subscribed to this school of thought, right? And so it crosses party lines, but it is actually informing our policies with Israel, our military aid, armaments, all sorts of things in the Middle East, because there are American voting citizens and donors and politicians and legislatures that are actually egging on a final showdown in the Middle East, an armed conflict, because it brings us closer to the return of Jesus for the second coming. And you're like, whoa, 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 hold the presses, like separation of church and state, what? Right? So everyone's entitled to their own religious beliefs. That's one of the pillars of American civil society, right? But when a small subsection of the population start influencing literally geopolitics and are actually egging us on to a final confrontation, you're like, we should really be talking about this together. So it's not even like we're not on the same page. We're not even in the same books. So that is a capital R rapture that it would be really important for us all to think more about, right? And to have considered inputs on whether or not the choices we're making, and that's just one example, right? There are other ones where, for instance, like the techno-utopian rapture, even Elon's discussions of like moving to Mars, Stephen Hawking agreed, right? The idea that if we don't figure a way to get off planet by the end of this century, we could be doomed. We might snuff it. That's a major, major assumption for a bunch of super smart people to have come to.
And of course, it begs the question: okay, if we're going, who gets to go and who decides?
Yeah, all sorts of things, right?
Yeah.
And those all become sort of redemptive stories, but only for a tiny 1% population.
Yeah.
So then if that's the situation, right? We're in a world of increasing volatility, crisis, uncertainty. Lots of people are wigging out, and it's super tempting to want to kind of leapfrog to a happily ever after. If not for everyone, at least for me and my people. Then the flip side is how do we, as individuals, not get overwhelmed by that? How do we not succumb to anxiety, depression, grief, right? Melancholy, the diseases of despair that we know so much about these days? How are we not deeply traumatized by this unspooling of our reality? And that's the recapturing of the lowercase rapture, right? Our own personal bliss, belonging, wholeness, vitality, aliveness, integration, health. So we need to recapture our personal lowercase raptures in order to be able to draw from the healing, the inspiration, and the connection that we need to address the capital R rapture. How does this all go down?
Awesome. Sort of like become the change you want to see in the world type thing. So if we want to become that change, then what are the tools that we can use to facilitate that change? Which is a lot of what's laid out in the book.
Fundamentally, how to become a DIY, anti-fragile agent of change.
Love it. Okay, cool. Thank you for illuminating that. So part one of the book goes into this idea around choosing your own apocalypse and the meaning crisis in which we find ourselves now. So we've got meaning 1.0 kind of based on faith, then meaning 2.0 based on modernism, and then 3.0 is where we're kind of hoping to lean into now. Could you maybe just give a brief setup for that part of it?
Yeah, I mean, just super quickly and obviously, sort of for the last 10 to 100,000 years, we have always subscribed to the belief system of our tribe or clan, right? And that's given us the answers to who am I, what's going on, and what should I do with this one precious life kind of thing. So, right, like oriented us and informed us and directed us. And then really lately, last few decades, we've seen a sort of seeming, well, I wouldn't say permanent, but a new trend that is less and less people are affiliated with organized religions of any stripe. So that's the spiritual but not religious, the nuns, like none of the aboves, that group of people. And for the first time ever in human history, which is, it's an easy statement to say that, but really think about that. For the first time ever, as long as we've ever been human, there are more people that don't believe, right, and don't subscribe to a community of faith or practice than do. So that's
that's huge.
It's huge.
That's interesting.
Because you just think of the logic of it, right? You didn't flip the bird to your shaman or your rabbi, imam, or priest, and to be a believer was simply to be one of the people and entitled to the rights and privileges of our tribe. But to be a non-believer was to be a pagan, a heretic, an apostate, and actively persecuted and dehumanized. So it wasn't a good survival strategy to be outside the pale of the church, whatever flew on the roof.
As crazy as the world and its inhabitants are at the moment, which is we were talking about earlier. I mean, you could take any slice of history or prehistory and probably think from that perspective, the world's gone mad, and so has everyone else. But I wonder if, it's the circles that I run in. It seems to me that more people are spiritual, in quotes, than ever before, right? As things are kind of falling apart and there's all this tribalism and chaos on one end. But I wonder if people are less spiritual in terms of being associated with a religious organization or identifying with a particular theology or belief system, but are perhaps more people open to the idea that there is some sort of spiritual nature to life itself and are seeking in various ways, maybe however independently, to become closer to that and to integrate that into their lives. I mean, that's my only hope, kind of, is that we are finding our way. We might have just left the church as a whole to do it.
Yeah, and I mean, just know that's not a novelty, right? Or an aberration. That's a deeply American expression of religiosity, right? So the first and second Great Awakenings were in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and they ripped through the colonies. Literally, they were called the burned over districts where those awakenings had happened, and their complaint, right, was, we are sick and tired of the stuffy orthodoxy, the rules and regs of our parents and grandparents and their orthodox religions. We crave and yearn for and deserve direct experience. This is my own personal Jesus, right? This is this sort of walking with the Lord. This is notions of grace, charismatic possession, right? Or inhabitation. And like 1803, Cane Ridge, Kentucky, man, they had basically the Woodstock meets Burning Man of their era. And it was the far western hemisphere of the country at the time, the Appalachian Ridge, right? It was bumfuck Kentucky. They had over 10,000 people gather. There were so many crowds that the charismatic preachers, right, that were drawing the big crowds, just like DJs, had to build scaffolding to be up above the crowd. People stayed up all night. They were swigging whiskey. They were getting busy. They were playing fiddle and banjo tunes. It was a total rager. And this is 1803, right? So this notion of what you just described with the spiritual but not religious is actually 100% in keeping with this persistent American religiosity.
Right.
Versus some novelty or aberration.
So we're still on this upward bound hockey stick.
Well, we're seekers.
Yeah.
Right. We're mystics, magical thinkers, seekers. I mean, even Trump, where people say he's, factually challenged and makes shit up that he wants to be more true, and just, a lie repeated often enough, said Frederick Goebbels, becomes the truth, right? It actually has roots in New Age thought, just like The Secret. Norman Vincent Peale was his minister. One of his only bouts of quote unquote observant Christianity was actually to the power of positive thinking guy, right? Which weds to The Secret and New Age thought of manifestation, right? So you're like, oh, this is the same as it ever was.
That's interesting.
And we've all come out of the same goofy ass American spiritual soup.
Oh, that's hilarious, man. So in terms of breaking down where we find ourselves now, one thing that I have noticed, despite the fact that I think more and more people are starting to embrace some sort of spiritual practice, is that the divisiveness and the tribalism is just out of control, partially because I think it's just the nature of things to sort of cyclically go that way, right? Because you lean too far one way and there's kind of this rebound effect, and it goes too far the other way, and we're always kind of boomeranging back and forth between conserving what once was that we value and embracing the new, and the fear of what's new to the people that want to embrace the old and all that, call it left, right, liberal, conservative. But perhaps because everyone has a microphone now, it's just, I don't know if it's worse or if people are just louder because everyone has an Instagram microphone or whatever they have, right? Everyone can pop up their own website and be a news source now. But I'm sitting back just going like, wow, man, can everyone just take it down a notch? Let's relax. I mean,
Yeah, for sure.
I think there are more people who are probably, because these are the people I like to think that I'm around and consider myself amongst their ranks that kind of like just resting in the middle, right? And not seeking an extreme, but just kind of the people, I guess, that have moved here to Texas too recently that I know is kind of, I just want to do good in the world, be as kind as possible, successful as possible, and just not be fucked with. you know, and I don't have any desire to
Maybe
impose.
go bow hunting on some shrooms with my bros. I mean, is that so wrong?
I mean, we could, we could. I coined a phrase a couple of days ago. I think we're going to see if it goes viral, called Texifornian. So you heard it here first, folks. No, it is. We are all hilarious memes of ourselves, but I think that more people, in terms of their worldview, really just want to get along with people and just have a family, have a career, buy a house, just live their life. And then the voices on both sides of this just happen to be the loudest. So it seems like there's more of them, whether you call that, fundamentalist right wingers or crazy cultural Marxist left wingers. I mean, I just think the people in the middle aren't as vocal. Do you share that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, our buddy Tristan Harris, who founded the Center for Humane Technology, he was the Google ethicist and then did that Social Dilemma documentary.
Yeah.
Right, he uses the phrase limbic capitalism, meaning it's just going straight into our primal fight, flight, survival instincts, and it's all algorithmically optimized. So you're right? The moderate middle has always been the extremes. I mean, we've got the story of the American Revolution and the founding of this republic from the propagandists who won.
Right.
But if you take a look at actually what was happening in the colonies and what of course, they were all loyal English subjects. I mean, a few here and there had their grievances and grumbles, but their identity was 1,000% English or British. So the Tories who were like, you guys are a bunch of yahoos and you're about to do a smash and grab for your own benefits, we're not in, right? Got flogged off to Canada. They all had to flee, right? So you even split the population there. But I think that go ahead and give me a rerun on the last tee up so that I can land it exactly.
What I'm seeing from my perspective is that we are at war. There's a culture war, the tribalism. Is it really as bad as it seems,
No.
or is it just amplified by the algorithms and the noisiest people who are captured by their limbic system and in a trauma loop who are just making a bunch of noise?
So we have always had this moderate middle, and especially right now, our perception doesn't reflect demographic reality because they've done some fascinating studies on the kind of the usual suspects platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, whatever, and have found that the 90% of the posts and retweets, so 90% of our kind of user generated content, right, is actually coming from less than 10% of the population. And because it's limbic capitalism and it's algorithmically optimized, you can either do cuteness and adoration, the kitten puppies, or you do outrage.
Yeah.
And outrage is almost always an us-them dynamic. And so we're now getting AI weaponization and optimization of that fringe 5% on either side, screaming at each other across the middle. And because those are our visual reference points, no man's land is looking increasingly sketcy to hang out in. You're like, oh, this is like Verdun. This is like World War I trench warfare. There's nothing but barbed wire and mustard gas up here, right? So I'm going to go hauling ass back into the nearest foxhole. But those foxholes have moved further and further apart, right? And they're being manned by loopier and loopier extremists. So yeah, I would say that perception is wildly distorted from the number of people who have always just like those Tories and those colonists, they just wanted their farms. Because think about if George Washington and his crew came, they still killed all the cows, trampled the fields, slept with their daughters, did whatever they did. No one wanted that. We have always around the world wanted a chance to live our lives as quietly and peacefully as possible and to have our children have a better life than we did. And I think that is a profoundly unifying human experience. And it's important for us to remember it as we seek to bridge those extreme divides.
I have a dream that, I mean, I don't like politics or really know that much about them in general. But what if that group in the middle, the biggest yet least vocal group, actually started to consolidate some power and even form a political party of
Well,
sorts,
dude,
right?
here's the most interesting thing I've heard is it comes out of the
Like,
digital.
why do we have so much power? Not we. I mean, I guess I would consider myself part of that group, but they're the ones that just kind of seem to be, blown wherever the wind goes from the forces on both sides that are more vocal and aggressive.
Well, there is a nascent movement. We actually had some folks that were policy wonks and analysts in DC come to our last event and just kind of give us updates on what they're up to. And they're doing parallel democracy movements around the world. And so they're launching and standing up different ways of doing it. And one of the more interesting examples is from Taiwan, which is increasingly in the news these days, but it's liquid democracy or digital democracy. And it's basically one of the premises, and it's the kind of thing that could have to me, it seems the most credible third-party shot. Much more so than Perot, much more so than other, moonshot options, which is you use, blockchain-enabled voting, so stable, secure, anonymous, falsifiable, all those kinds of things. And you basically just poll the citizenry on opinions on all the major social and legislative issues. And you have a candidate that simply stands up and pledges to do their best to enact the legislation of the supermajority at all times. That's their platform.
Oh, wow.
So you think about gun control, you think about reproductive rights, you think about all these things, and there's clear supermajorities of actual voters. But by the time you go through the cheese grater of electoral colleges and congressional representations and everything, the system is gamed mightily by less than 30% of the population. So that right there, if everybody did the $10 donations or the $20 donations, and you actually created war chests, right, for the supermajority candidates, that would be a direct democracy by the people for the people workaround.
Wow. I like it.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah, it is very interesting. It's hopeful. I've not heard of it, but it's kind of one of those things I'm like, is this all we've got? Really, guys?
Yeah, seriously, a bunch of fucking really old dudes saying, okay, boomer shit left and right. You're like, no, just step down.
Even, and like I said, even looking at both sides, I'm just like, this is just corny. That's what my wife would say. She just breaks it down like, this is corny. It's just lame.
Wah, wah.
Yeah, I mean, leave aside the, the destructive nature of the system and, obviously how the citizens are usually on the short end of the stick of the geopolitical agenda. But it's also it's just lame, There's got to be smarter people than this. And what are we going to do to perhaps get them in place? So that's exciting. Another thing that I found, I mean, there were a lot of, statistics and stuff you cited in the book that were shocking and troubling. One of them was that there are more suicide deaths in the U.S. than disease and war combined.
And I think that might even be worldwide.
Oh, okay. And that, just one of the things I parsed out. And I was like, if you kind of need to know the state of things, that's a pretty solid representation of how, out of touch we are and disconnected we are.
Yeah, and this kind of goes to that meaning crisis as well, because, and I don't mean this in any way to be alarmist, I just mean this as a sort of heartfelt mapping of possible futures, right? Is that if we are seeing rises in diseases of despair, if we're seeing that more people are choosing to step off this wheel than to participate in the life they were given, right? Those are serious, health indicators of how we're doing. And then you survey Gen Z, and I think it's like 30 to 40%, a significant chunk, are opting out of thinking about or planning to have a family because they don't believe, right, that it is worth bringing another life into. So that's effectively intergenerational suicide.
Right.
It's just a different timescape.
Right. Self-imposed depopulation scheme.
Yeah. And we know that in the entire developed world, there's a massive demographic cliff coming where we're going to have way too many old people and not enough young people, babies and workers to replace them. And those are massive and acute, right? They're not just kind of sort of. And so you look at that and you're like, okay, that is the working definition of cross-cultural trauma, is that not only are we experiencing the challenges and griefs and disruptions of this world as it's unfolding right now, but we've lost, because of the meaning crisis, we've lost all of our old comforting and orienting stories about what it means, what's our part in it, and what do we do next. So in that kind of narrative collapse, it does feel really essential for us to find, stories that serve, that activate the better angels of our nature and remind us of the high watermarks of our culture, our commitments, our values. right?
Yeah.
Like universal humanism, all men and women,
Yeah.
regardless of race, color, or creed, are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's badass, right? Super noble and idealistic, never ever attained, radically riddled with compromises and hypocrisy along the way, and unintended consequences along the way, and still the best fucking thing humans have ever come up with,
Definitely.
right? And
Yeah.
and the only thing we've ever espoused, right, that transcends our evolutionary biological imprint to care for kith, kin, and clan, and to actually extend the same care and concern to strangers on the other half of the world that don't look like us, dress like us, or worship the same gods. That's revolutionary, and we could
Yeah.
lose it.
Yeah. Well, let's see if we can find some ways to avoid having that happen. So, in part 2 of the book, you talk about this alchemist cookbook,
Mhm.
and you explore some of the ways that we can create meaning 3.0. And you identify, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because I really want to focus on the one most fun part, which is the sexuality, and then, as I said, get into some of the culture or ethical cult building as we close up. But the 5 tools are respiration, embodiment, substances, music, and sexuality. And I guess we could go into substances first, if I'm going to do my best to kind of keep us on track here. But when you covered that particular tool, one of the most interesting parts to me was William James, the famous philosopher's use of nitrous oxide. So I just wanted, because we used to call it hippie crack back in the 90s when I was going to dead shows, and I used some recently. I was doing some stem cell stuff that was a little uncomfortable, and so I had a little nitrous tank there in the office. It was provided. And it was the first time I think I'd done nitrous oxide since Grateful Dead parking lots back in the day. And I was like, this is pretty good. This could be useful, and then I come back and start reading in your book that it does have some history of being used for something other than anesthesia and, coming down off acid at a dead show. So maybe give us a little bit of, the perspective of substances as a tool, because I think many people think of it as just recreational escapism or addiction. And then some people are, of course, fervent fans of psychedelics are going to save the world. And maybe they're somewhere in the middle, which I think is kind of where you landed.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking of like NYU neuroscientist Oliver Sacks that most people are familiar with. He said, say what you want about drugs, but they work on demand, right? And then Mircea Eliade, the University of Chicago comparative religionist in the 1950s, he wrote that famous book, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. And there's a sense of say what you will about them, but they actually provide a repeatable and relatively consistent shift in neurochemistry and resultant psychology. So experimentally, they're really valuable. So, which is why there's been this explosion of learning about theories of mind, consciousness, all these things with the combination of the psychedelic renaissance lately and fundamentally high-grade measurement devices like fMRIs. So now we can put somebody in a definitive known state and scan their brain in this clunky $10 million device, right? And we know repeatably that a comparable thing is happening.
Yeah.
Right. So there is that. And in your description of nitrous, and to me, part of the experimental insight is less what does a quote unquote drug do? It's what do we do when we are on that drug or metabolizing that drug? And therefore, how do we learn the knobs and levers to get back to that state using a much broader palette of interventions?
Right.
So as an example of that, Carl Diceroth, who's the father of optogenetics, he's a professor at Stanford, has done a study with epileptics and mice, so both human and mice, and ketamine, the dissociative anesthetic that is both used in surgeries and is also recreationally used and abused, right? And he did it to try and prompt an out-of-body experience. That's the dissociative part, right? And they wanted to see whether that dissociation, getting out of my head, basically, even for 15 to 45 minutes, did that help with depression and anxiety? So they triggered it and they figured out, they had the mice were doing whatever the little twitchy thing they do to indicate they're dissociated, and the people were self-reporting. And they then zeroed in on, what was happening in the brain, and they found a specific central region near the hippocampus that was basically giving off a 3 hertz EEG signature. And 3 hertz is damn nearly the lowest. We're sort of up in the 30s and 40s in beta activity. Then there's alpha activity, sort of flow states, theta activity, slipping off to sleep, or deep meditative states. Delta is damn near brain dead. So it's zero point 0.1 to 4 hertz is that range. And he's like, oh, okay. So when these folks under the influence of ketamine are having an out-of-body experience, right, their brain is firing at this 3 hertz. So then, and this is my point about breadcrumbs, drugs as breadcrumbs, not as final destinations. They then went back and electrically stimulated the patient's brain, same spot to 3 hertz, no ketamine. Still had the dissociative out-of-body experience. Yes. And then that prompted a study with...
Where do I get this machine? No, I'm just kidding.
Exactly. So this is what prompted the research, is then a different group of research to see that work and be like, okay, let's see if we can repeat this with nitrous oxide, because we know nitrous oxide, according to the MIT anesthesiology department, actually creates double amplitude delta wave brainwaves for 3 to 12 minutes. So after ingestion of a 50-50 gas blend, probably what you were breathing during your mask, after 3 to 12 minutes, you get double amplitude delta, which is this crazy near brain dead state. Think like flatliners, normally only accessible in deep and dreamless sleep and no other time in the waking spectrum. Suddenly your eyes open, it's like backdoor lucid dreaming. You're basically like eyes open, totally alert, going through double amplitude, huge cresting brainwaves at this like frequency, where you can see anything you can think of and think of anything you can see with a 300 IQ for 3 to 12 minutes. And so, and wouldn't you know it, they wanted to see, does this help depression like that ketamine did? And the answer was also yes. And then when you do radar plots of 5-MeO-DMT, so basically those shots from on top of the 2 hemispheres of the brain, and they typically color in which parts are firing and which parts aren't, the entire fucking thing lights up like a Christmas tree on the peak of 5-MeO. So you're like, oh, this is super interesting. So 3 of the known most highly engaging, information-dense compounds known to man all correlate with the delta wave frequency, which also correlates with positive psychological and mental and physical health outcomes, which also appears to be super information rich. So to me, that's where that nitrous oxide story, that's where any mention of substances as tools really comes full circle. You're like, oh, okay, what they do is they provide ways for us to create repeatable experiments and gather data to much more deeply understand the workings of our own neurophysiology and its impacts, tangential and orthogonal as they may be, on our psychology and lived experience. And can we use that to better engineer, right, the Alchemist Cookbook, the tools to blow ourselves
Wow,
sky
that's God, there's so many fascinating tidbits in there. With the nitrous oxide, it's interesting because, and I didn't walk away from that procedure going, oh, I need to get my own tank. But I found it really interesting to be dissociated, yet still have my faculties.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was still the one grabbing the mask when I felt too much pain and like wanted a little bit more, right? But I was there, but not there. It's a really interesting state to be in, and one that I'm not entirely unfamiliar with. But that one, I think I was really tracking because I wanted to stay present, but also didn't want to kind of be traumatized by the discomfort I was feeling with all these needles going in my freaking ear and whatnot. Yeah, so it was interesting.
Stem cells in your ear?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. It's pretty wild. Definitely would not advise without. I had a little bit of ketamine too, 50 milligrams and a little nitrous. Yeah. It was for tinnitus and hearing loss. Takes 3 months to see if it works. So I don't know yet. It was only a month ago.
Did you get to Bluetooth your own tunes for the surgery?
Actually, yeah.
You mind if I just rock this out a little bit?
No, it's funny. Both doctors that I've worked with most recently with stem cells, one is Matt Cook out in San Jose, and this was John Lawrence in Sarasota, Florida. And Matt Cook, I was mentioning the Grateful Dead, Matt Cook just blares the dead through all his surgical procedures. So last time I was like, this is cool. Imagine if hospitals were like that, right? It's like, light some incense, create a vibe, put on some good music, and allow your nervous system to relax into the process of hopefully healing.
Yeah, make your leader be like, there's no Cornell, but this is pretty good.
And then you mentioned the 5-MeO-DMT and the times that I've experienced that. I mean, when I re-emerge and there's a person there to think about it, I'm always wondering, what the fuck was happening in my brain? I was like, I need a QEEG next time. I was so curious. So that's fascinating too, because there's just no other in my experience of 51 years, there's nothing that even comes close to that experience on all levels. But it does seem to be really centered in your brain. I mean, you just know, like, holy shit, something very unique is happening here, leaving apart all of the, the mystical sort of spiritual nature of it, but just the physiology of it is just freaking mind blowing. It's like you just left the planet.
Yeah, I
Yet
mean,
there you are.
and to me, that's actually the cutting edge. I keep waiting for the sort of psychedelic renaissance to get here because we're sort of very much locked in the. For a while, it was should we or shouldn't we, like moral justification, right? Then became like giddy reports of all the new breakthrough science that legitimates it and validates it, and then it sort of became hyper medicalized. So we're only ever talking about DSM-5 and reimbursable health insurance claim kind of stuff. We're talking about this is to suicide, this is to trauma, this is to depression, this is to anxiety, this is to AD&D, this is to bulimia, this is to smoking cessation, right? And it's all working backwards from, basically the medicalized pathologies of our default world, right? Very little is actually ontologically exploring or mapping what the fuck is going on up there. So, right. So if, for instance, you can find a fairly coherent neurological signature, let's just say there's 10 vital signs. And if you tweak each part of your body or brain into those optimal zip codes or sweet spots, you tend to have these profound, non-ordinary states of consciousness with hyper-rich information, inspiration, lateral thinking, pattern recognition, cogitation, right? Then where are we going? Is there a coherent place, or are these all just optimized meat suits in our wetware? Right, so it's enclosed within our skin encapsulated egos, or are we accessing an information layer that is basically extemporaneous, and I don't even know what the parallel one would be, sort of not of this physicality or embodiment, disembodied and extemporaneous, right?
Yeah.
And if so, what are the physics of that metaphysics? How does access coming and shuttle running from those domains? How does it work? How does information there? Because it sure as shit isn't one-to-one and linear. If it was, right, we'd all just play the lottery all day, right? It would be, but it's orthogonal and slippery. So the relationship between information from those realms can, on the one hand, be the source of epiphany, sort of the apocryphal story of Watson and Crick, or Buckminster Fuller's design realm, or Einstein, downloading general relativity on a rowboat in Lake Geneva, right? There's those moments, the graces, the muses, whatever it would be, that we've always spoken of. And we've always done it with some form of prepositional distance from just our own thinking. From time immemorial. There's always been there's no way this was divine muses. Of course it was. That kind of a thing, right? So beginning to actually, instead of just bungee jump into the back of beyond and everybody's experience is just psychological content, or it's for a medical condition, or it's for whatever, it's like, actually, hey, what? If you put your body and brain into that receiver signal, if you tune your antenna in these directions, you appear to receive information that is non-local, way smarter, way more complex, often funnier, like all the things that it also appears to do, right? And what is that space? Couldn't we start at least provisionally mapping it? So to me, that's a super interesting branch
Very much
of the
so.
psychedelic conversation, because most people haven't done it in a postmodern, multi-perspectival way. They've seen what they've seen, and they've then begun busily painting and decorating their very own new shiny reality tunnel, but they're just trapped in their own version. Versus, and that's sort of like, what app am I using on my iPad? Versus making the move to be like, well, wait, there's a home screen with all the apps, and I can double click on the one that's useful, but I'm not stuck or wed to that worldview exclusively. And then further inquiry, if you wanted, would be then who's holding the iPad, looking at the home screen, choosing between the apps or the reality tunnels we click into. So to me, that would be super fun and high time.
I love that. Yeah, it's funny to see kind of where that movement is going now, right? And as you said, kind of leaning into the medical system, which already, I mean, I guess there is something wrong with this, but it's being adopted kind of by the sick care model, right? There's the assumption that there's something wrong with you, but what if these tools were actually just being viewed from the perspective of what's right with you?
Yeah.
Right? And how do we find it? And the interesting thing too that you alluded to was, it's not even that doing, breath work or a sexual practice or a plant medicine or something like that is doing the thing to you. It's triggering something that you're doing, right? There's an empowering piece there. So maybe by the mapping you're describing, we can each get better at knowing the terrain and finding our way there, and then finding the modalities to get there that are compatible with our, the confines of what we're willing to do and not do, and of course, which are the most safe and appropriate. One thing that I thought was really cool, I knew we were going to have to do like 5 interviews. Honestly, I'm like, oh God, so many things I want to talk about, and I'm trying to get back to a couple of them. But you gave this example of the mountain oak people. Is that how you pronounce it? Or Ak people of the Western New Guinea, and how they treat psychedelics, and these rites of passage that you kind of give as a broad sort of guidepost, or sense of a mapping of adolescence, marriage, and death. And you illustrated they have this really interesting system wherein the initiates have to really be sort of grandfathered in, right? It's like the whole tribe isn't just taking mushrooms all the time. Mm-hmm. There are rites of passage, and it's done very intentionally. I thought that was really interesting because the intentionality around substances, as you know, is everything. So what else might you have to say briefly on that piece of just, a word of warning for all those that are really excited and just kind of running willy-nilly into the forest naked on some mushrooms?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say, wear your chacos, But I think, the mountain Ak people is just one really cool example, because I think it is fair to say that we are absolutely outside of time, history, and precedent with unrestricted access to everybody, all you can eat, right? That's never happened anywhere. That's no way to manage such powerful substances or experiences. So everybody talks these days about, yes, integration. We need more integration. We're doing this ketamine clinic, and of course we plan to do integration, or go to a festival. Make sure you get your integration. It's like the sort of elusive, like vitamin C, but no one's doing it. And the reason we're not doing it is because it's not a culture to keep it or hold it. Mm-hmm. Outside of harm reduction and emergency events and that kind of thing, or specific medicalized patient-client relationships, right? And so the mountain Ak people kind of have almost a Montessori approach to how you have access. So it's not tops down, stingy priests. It's kind of open source. And like a Montessori classroom, the rule for those little kids that prevents it from being mayhem is the whole place is stocked with awesome, and you are allowed, welcome, and encouraged to take anything off the shelf that you're drawn to, provided you've already been introduced to the proper use and care, right? Taking it out, working with it, and putting it away again, right? By the director, by a teacher. Then you're good to go. It's a little bit like a CrossFit gym where you can't just roll in and start throwing bars around. You have to do a 3-day fundamentals or intensive. Like, this is Olympic lifting. This is the different bits and pieces. Now you can come here and work out till you puke. Right?
Yeah.
So with the mountain Ak, they have 3 different substances and a tiered sort of roster of initiation levels. So it starts out with ginger, which we might not think of as much, but I bet if you pounds of raw ginger on an empty stomach, not having slept, et cetera, you might get someplace, right? Yeah. Or even just strong medicinal tonics to start with, right? So I think there's 3 to 4 levels of that. Then there's tobacco. And again, it's not like our American spirits or Marlboros, right? This is probably Nicotina rustica, which is like 17% nicotine, not 1% nicotine. And they roll up these giant cone blunts and just like puff tough, right? So they get
I'm seeing all these 13-year-olds puking their guts out.
Yeah. They get close to nicotine narcosis. Like, that's what they're actually at the high end of that. That's what they're gunning for, right? And then finally, there are the mushroom initiations. And what I thought, and they're different strains, they're different species. And there's, I think, 3 of them. And the first 2 is kind of your elective bits as you get older, as you mature. But then the final one is kind of reserved for their sort of lamas/PhDs. Mm-hmm. So each invitation is fewer and fewer people are actually leveled up to the higher reaches, right? And then that one is balls out. Like, it's a crazy toxic mushroom. It's not like Amanita, but it's something that's no fun, and you would not want to like score right now on the dark web and try for yourself, right? It can kill you and would if it wasn't for all the specialized, ritualized preparations, consumptions, hardships. And it's still a roll of the dice. That's what makes it the big daddy initiation. That's the boss level, right? And the key thing, which I think is just awesome about the end result of that, is that they have an open source approach to revelation. So if you get initiated to the highest level and you trip balls and see some shit, you get to bring that back and you get to add it to the holy book, right? So rather than you being burned at the stake as a heretic, like Joan of Arc, you don't get to talk to God. That door shut a long time ago, right? They keep updating their scripture with the latest revelations from their most initiated elders.
So cool.
Isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think just as a kid that didn't go through any rites of passage and put myself through a lot of painful ones, I think about just how incredible that could be if it was done right. And you point out in the book that we give our kids amphetamines, antidepressants, and antipsychotics without even batting an eye. But imagine telling someone that you want to give your kid their first 5-MeO dose at 13 or 14. I mean, you get thrown in prison, right? And people would think you were insane and abusive. I mean, and not that that wouldn't be, right? But just as a stark contrast to that, we don't really think about anything in terms of really potentially dangerous drugs that we're giving our kids. Yet to many people, the thought of initiating a younger person through the intentional use of something like a plant medicine, mushroom, et cetera, is just completely out of our cultural possibility.
Yeah, and to be clear, I would think that a 13 to 14-year-old getting exposed to 5-MeO would be child abuse.
Well, I mentioned that
Yeah.
because it wasn't just an idea that popped in my head. One of the facilitators that I sat with that particular medicine is from a tribe in Mexico and explained to me that they do use 5-MeO DMT, the bufo toad, as an initiation for kids when they turn 13. I don't know if it's the full thing,
sure.
which could be very destabilizing. So yeah, I'm with you. I'm not.
But that's also within a culture and community
Right.
of care.
And
right?
they
which
probably,
is
like
distinct.
these folks from New Guinea, have, a whole cultural system that makes that safe and appropriate and hopefully useful.
Yeah.
But I remember him telling me that and just going, man, I could have really used that probably at 13, or maybe not, maybe too much. I don't know.
Well, that's the other thing, right? We talked about phases of life. And then so we use the Mountain Ock people as an example, but then that idea of adolescent initiations, maybe 16, 18, somewhere in there, marriage, obviously union, communion, and then end of life preparation. Those to me, if there was ever sort of a TLDR to my perspective on psychedelics, is I think they, used appropriately and in an informed and enculturated way, they can be powerful catalyst for healing, inspiration, and connection. And in general, people should be doing more, less often. So schedule those 3 lifetime heroic doses and initiatory experiences, right? And then process and integrate the living fuck out of them for the rest of your days. Just like Medicine Quest for the Lakota or any other indigenous people, they didn't, they weren't like, oh, bro, and then I did the circle of stones, and then I didn't fucking eat anything for 3 or 4 days, and then Wakan Tonka, man, he like landed on my head. I can't wait to go back next week.
Yeah.
Like they had it, they cherished it, they put it in their medicine bag, and they worked with it for the rest of their days.
Yeah. Well, I think with something like 5-MeO, I mean, even if someone never so much as had a sip of beer or hit off a joint their entire life, one solid experience of that is enough, probably for multiple lifetimes. I mean, that's a lot to integrate, to your point.
Like, we are all just incredibly complicated starlight.
It's not something I think most people would benefit from, doing all the time or doing even many times, But I think about sometimes because my parents get older and I think, oh man, I'm facing their mortality and then look at my own mortality and I think, man, how am I going to process when they pass? And I don't know what I will do.
You get a ratcheting, you get this, you feel the entire wagon wheel clunking forwards and you're like, oh, I'm now on the sharp end of my family line.
Yeah, totally.
I had no appreciation for how much they were just breaking trail ahead of me.
Yeah, so it's something I'm kind of pondering, oh yeah, there's going to be another initiation, right?
Yeah.
And I have a number of ways to approach that. All right, let's get into the sexuality, right? In part 1 of the sexual part, you kind of give the evolutionary context for sexuality and compare McKenna's stoned ape theory to what might be even more likely, or at least equally so, the horned ape theory, right? And how much sexuality has actually shaped who and what we are as a species. And what I thought was also really interesting is the fact that you illuminated the lack of research by and large scientifically. It's like sexuality is just kind of tucked away in a drawer, and people that try to insert that word into their research papers, get their funding pulled. And,
Oh, yeah.
it's just crazy. I never thought about it because I'm not really in the academic circles and I just see what comes out of them, right? But I'm like, wow, we are really missing a huge piece here. So, yeah, maybe just give people a little bit of framework for that, the horned ape, just the evolutionary part of that.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, and just to put it in some perspective, right? We've split the atom. We've built Hubble space telescopes and large hadron colliders to recreate the conditions of the Big Bang, right? And it wasn't until the mid 90s we had an anatomically accurate map of a woman's clitoris.
Oh my God.
Right? You're like, what?
Oh, dude.
Right? The highest concentration
Oh,
of nerve
God.
endings in any body, including men's, right?
Yeah.
And the central reproductive organ, right, of life on this planet. And you're like, wait a sec, 1990, what? How exactly?
That's
So,
insane.
yeah, so just to frame kind of the evolutionary run at this, because we're just so locked into our psychological orientation to our sexuality and cultural stories and
Yeah.
norms and taboos and all of these things, just to pan back, right, and do the kind of anthropologist from space overview is we are utterly unique among 4,000 species of animals in our sexuality. So human sexuality is in no way normative. It's a complete freaky aberration, and very, very specifically in the frequency, intensity, intentions, results of our sexuality. So, for instance, everything from male penis size, right, which is 4 times any of our other great ape cousins.
That's so crazy.
Crazy.
You're talking about like 500-pound gorillas
Have
and
1.5-inch jimmies.
Poor guys.
Yeah, right. and you're like, oh, okay, so this was a mating signal, and evolutionary psychologist Jeff Miller says that is likely a selection process by the females, but it's basically a status display saying, look, the phrasing was, look, I can pack all of this. I'm so fit and healthy. I'm such a G that I can afford to pack all this useless protoplasm onto the end of my penis. So I should be a pick. It's like learning to dance in tango, or for a man to, right? That's saying, right?
Yeah.
I've got bodily control. I've got time
Yeah.
to learn these things. It's sexy for those signaling reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And then also women's hips and breasts, right? I mean, most animals only have swollen breasts when they're actively lactating, right? Wide hips and full breast impede evasion and mobility, right? So they're an anti-selection process other than, right? It serves some sexual selection advantage. Then there's concealed ovulation on the part of the females. We're not purple-bottomed baboons, right? Or mooing cows that all know their cycles and signal them, and it's widely understood. And frequent female orgasm. Clearly not as frequent as sex-positive, therapists and everybody else would want and argue for, but still much more so than the animal kingdom, where the animal kingdom is, sex is nasty, brutish, and short. It often leaves you dead or at risk, right? You can get clipped. There's competitors. There's other predators. There's a whole host of things. You get in, you get out, you get done. You forget about it until it briefly, during estrus or heat, consumes everybody and then is gone again. So our persistent interest, our persistent physiological displays, the unique adaptations, you're like, oh, wow, we are absolute freaks in the animal kingdom. And then what if we told you that somewhere in the forest, there's a male and a female of this very special species, and they have magic bits. And when they put their magic bits together for long enough, in just the right combination, light shoots out their brains, right? You're like, who are those things? And then sometimes it's such a magical and special thing that it can even create new life. And this is this whole amazing, wonderful package. And look at those little creatures. And they can basically fuck themselves to God consciousness. How about that? So you're like, oh, so now we've done the anthropologist from space bit. We've just kind of taken a clear-eyed look at not that we are just in the water not knowing we're wet, of dysfunctional, socially conditioned, indulgent, repressed, psychosexual hooey.
Right.
We can actually be like, wow, we are virtually alone in the animal kingdom to be wired up the way we're wired up. And if you were looking for the consciousness explosion of 70,000 years ago, whenever it was, when we suddenly kind of got super smart, right? And known tools and fire and flint napping and all these good things and music and a bunch of other stuff. You know, Terence McKenna famously said, we came down out of the trees, we picked through dung for bugs, for food, mushrooms grew on dung, ergo we must have found and eaten those mushrooms also, right, et cetera, hence, tripping clever apes. And, maybe, right, maybe. It's a tenuous theory, and there's definitely mixed opinions within sort of solid anthropological academic circles. But you're like, well, what else could have produced sustained brain change? Would have been naturally and intuitively and self-incenting or autotelic. Like people are gonna do it. You don't need a billboard campaign. You don't need tax rebates. People are gonna do it, right? And wide, ubiquitously available. Not just, let's just say, in the little microclimates where those particular mushrooms grew. And you would say that, oh yeah, sexuality is one of, other than breathing and food or hunger, right? It is one of the top 3 strongest evolutionary drives. So we know we're hard coded, like evolution, through the kitchen sink and making sure we could pull that off every generation with no instruction manual. So you're like, definitely it's autotelic, right? We're going to do it. We're going to figure out a way.
I love the example you give of the film The Blue Lagoon, which I haven't seen probably since I was a kid and it was out, but it's a great example of what you just described.
Yeah, right.
So you have two young people that grow into puberty and go, oh, what's this thing?
Yeah. Your chocolate, my peanut butter.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Exactly. So then you realize, oh, now our sexuality actually checks all the boxes if we were kind of doing the forensic research as to what kind of practice, behavior, substance, whatever, was the catalyst for our expansive brain change. And Jared Diamond, the Pulitzer-winning author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, he writes about this, and he says, look, we think of basically fire, language, and bipedal mobility, like walking on twos, right, or our opposable thumbs, because we think of those as the cornerstones of human evolution. But in reality, you have to include sexuality in there. That our sexuality is so unique and potent because there's nothing else, right? I mean, you go back to us discussing the compounds like 5-MeO, like psilocybin, like MDMA, like ketamine, like any of these. There's virtually nothing else that so reliably and so intensely creates that kind of neurochemical cascade, right, of dopamine, endorphins, anandamide, oxytocin, serotonin, all the kind of goodies, right, that people generally zero in on when they're looking at mood altering or enhancement, right? Plus neurophysiology, right? The static electric discharge. It's almost like, when you've left your laptop open with way too many windows all week and then it just gets glitchy and Zoom doesn't work or YouTube won't play, right? You're like, and you have to do a cold reboot, right? So the orgasmic tension release and discharge through a primate nervous system with all of the soothing and mending and healing neurochemical cascade that happens during and after, right? Profoundly health-giving. And also back to that original question of recapturing our lowercase raptures in the face of uppercase raptures. Lots of crazy stories and possibilities about what could go badly wrong, right? The ability to discharge our micro PTSD that we're all just accumulating every day, just fibrillating, right? Frantic and bored, like, right? It's like crazy town, right? So to get to turn off our fritzing laptops, right? Through the death rebirth experience, right? Of orgasmic release, profoundly healthy if you just consider it from the category of sexual fitness. So if the evolutionary sexuality is like, hey, we're freaks and misfits in the animal kingdom, we have these very special capacities which we appear to have made use of, and they might even be responsible, right, for our evolution in complexity, self-awareness, functionality, right, and for sure pair bonding, right, and survival of our offspring, then shouldn't we have a sexual practice that is more than just exclamation point on the end of a really good day, like high five, honey, let's bang one out for the bank, right? Or power negotiating chip to dispense or withhold in order to get other things you value or care about.
Yeah.
Right? Which is our default.
The transactional.
Yeah, right? That's how most of us are doing it. It's either high fives or tit for tats.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And instead, what does sexual fitness look like that you would do, just like flossing your teeth, just like going for run, healthy cardio, just like strength and conditioning training? You're just like, of course, we would have protocols and practices that we engage in using this system, right, for maximal health, vitality, and well-being. And then, oh, by the way, if you really add them all up and you combine all these things, you can also get to profound magical, mystical, epiphanic states, which used to be the realms of either Tantra in the East or Western sex magic in the Hermetic traditions. And you're like, oh, now we can unlock those treasure chests, decode them with the science and the optimal psychology, so you're not having to keep the mythologies from centuries ago from places far away, and you can just decode the protocols. And you're like, oh, this is rad. And we can put it towards basically reclaiming our own healing, inspiration, and connection, our own trauma work, right, and our own relational work, and our own and even our own contemplative or mystical practice.
Wow, I think that's what was so compelling about this piece of the book, which took 2 whole sections, obviously. And
You gotta
as
snip the wires to the bomb.
But as someone who's thoroughly and probably way too much explored the first 2 categories of sexual expression, the transactional and also just, I don't know, just the end of the day explanation point, as you put it, right? And really, up until very recently in my life, never gave it much thought, but also have become kind of increasingly bored with that and unmotivated by that realm, to the point where at times I've thought, I might be getting older and like having low testosterone, but I don't think it's that. I think it's just, kind of played that card, right? And it's like, what else is there? And the what else is there barrier, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, is kind of like, oh God, I don't want to like become some tantric nut and like go through all of the,
Sting ruined that for the rest of us, didn't he? I mean,
all the accoutrement of all of the belief systems and the subcultures and all the things, like that's definitely not, my lane. So I think what you're resting on here and have explored in the book is really fascinating, because this is very easily personalized according to your preference. And we're just dealing with neurophysiology here, right? And so it's a matter of, not necessarily even having a partner, because some of these practices that you outline in the book could be a solo mission. But man, you just kind of have a partner that is somewhat compatible in their curiosity to explore these altered states and ways in which we can use sexuality as an actual practice and make something more meaningful out of it.
Yeah, you're basically like, hey, you want to go become time traveling space monkeys? What do you say? And you're like, yeah, sure, let's check that out.
Well, one thing that I remembered too, and I probably share a lot of things in this podcast my wife would not be happy about, but my experience in one particular occasion, and this probably should be happening more, and that's why I'm interested in learning about this, but in that post-orgasmic state that is, now there's been some study around that you explore in the book, I was having visuals. Like I thought I had taken a decent dose of mushrooms or something, and I'm kind of laying there going, what is happening? And it wasn't even that we did anything extraordinary. It just happened to be one day, this, nice afternoon, and the thing happened, and then this thing happened. And I thought, what the fuck is this? And I shared it with my wife, and she's like, yeah, I was just having that too. I was like, what is that? How do we do that again?
Yeah.
And so I think,
well, that's the middle section of the book.
This
is how you do it again. And then here's the end notes.
In the in the part 2 of the sex, and then the recipes, as you said at the end. So this isn't something that just has to be left up to chance. Like, oh, that was nice. I hope that happens again randomly. There are actually tools. So maybe you could explore some of those. Sound and breath, and some of the other ways in which one could create a more exalted or healing experience in their sexuality.
Yeah, and again, just to kind of unstick us, because again, sexuality is such a sticky topic, right? We almost always get gunged back up in our preconceptions and assumptions.
Yeah.
But just to kind of basically say, hey, look, 50% of this practice, if we're describing this, some form of stacked practice, meaning you're doing a bunch of things together to be complementary, right? And you're talking about something like the sexual yoga of becoming, right? Or sexual fitness is, kind of even like simpler category, but like things we would do with our physical and emotional relational arousal systems in order to increase our capacities, integration, et cetera, et cetera. Fully 50% of all the steps or instructions or options aren't sexual at all. It's just if you want to double it, you can weave in and blend sexuality.
Right.
And to your point,
which is why your book isn't like, grab the sex toy and put it here. The instructions, it's nothing in that realm, actually. That's interesting.
Yeah. And there's also individual practices, right, that you just described, and that could include intimate practice solo. But there's partner practices, which is more like acro yoga or aikido or massage or rock climbing, where it's better, safer, or more effective to do with another partner, right? And then there's potentially or couples practice where there's some degree of physical or emotional intimacy involved, therefore trust, right? And therefore it's probably best in a dedicated relationship with its own specific agreements around that practice and everything else.
Yeah.
So just to give everybody that sense of things. But the simplest is you just think of anything good. You could take theraguns, right? Like percussive massages. You could take Thai massage where we're actually applying traction to each other and lengthening our muscles and opening up our joint capsules. You can do breath work either to deeply relax or to animate and vitalize or to even, trip out in the sense of holotropic or hyperventilatory breathwork, shift state, right? You can do movement, spinal movement, and fascia. So the sliding surfaces of our body, the mobility of our pelvis, the undulations of our spine. You can engage in all those kinds of practices. So you could just be on a mat, on a bed, whatever it would be, soft, plushy space to be, right? And you could just be doing all of this kind of body work, healing and integration. And it's fantastic, especially to music. So you have music, sight, sound, all of those kind of things. And then you can layer in gas-assisted breathwork, oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, whatever those combinations and blends would be. You could have physician-prescribed oxytocin and ketamine nasal spray, right? Which would be a supplement. You can microdose Cialis to both partners to be boosting nitric oxide, the body-brain stuff, be boosting that, right? And then you can play with all those things. And then if you include sexual arousal and stimulation and combinations, now you're really into that sexual yoga of becoming space. You're like, oh, we're doing all the things and we're deliberately stacking them, right? So that they have maximum amplitude, right? How high and do I get into the information layer and how long is my hang time, right? Before I float back down, right? And you reduce the wavelength of the time it took, the metabolic half-life. If you do ayahuasca or LSD or even mushrooms, those are 8 to 12 hour experiences, and they're kind of slow run-ups and slow run-downs, and that you have to do quite a bit to get higher, but the higher both makes the shoulders weirder, right? You're exposed to vulnerable. You could be dealing with public situations and randos. You could be hungry, tired, cold. There's a whole bunch of things that can happen in those shoulders.
Yeah.
Right? It's like that bumper sticker on water bottles, like for deadheads, like set breaks are weird. Right? Like that, right? Like that's why. And so if you increase amplitude, decrease wavelength, not only do you get more information, but you come back without the body load or psychological vulnerabilities or exposures, and you can not fumble that football. So you can remember the bit of just crystalline insight, and you've done it in less time, which also fits in householders' paths. It fits in, right? There's many, many more days I'll have 90 minutes to 3 hours than I have 12.
Yeah, very much so.
Which gives us kind of the meso sacraments. People are talking about heroic dosages and they're talking about microdosing, but very few people are talking about meso dosing, the middle layer. And the middle layer is arguably the essential thing, because what's happening right now is people are going and blowing out the pipes. And whether that's, we go down to Peru and I do ayahuasca for 5 days straight and I come back and I'm like cross-eyed and fuzzy for 6 months trying to figure out what the fuck that was about, or I just went to Burning Man and I typed my obligatory 11 things that changed my life at Burning Man Medium post that no one wants to read. No one wants to read.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Right? But then we go from 186,000 miles a second, like speed of light, all the way back down to zero over, months, weeks, and years. And then we look for the next atom bomb, but we're not just spinning the flywheel with these periodized once a week, once a month, once a season touch points that could actually keep that momentum and keep us on a more expanded, integrated space.
God, and in an ongoing or, long-term relationship too, just think about the potential for longevity, right? You talked about the 7-year itch, and that there's actually, some changes that take place within people when they're in a partnership where at certain times you become bored or disinterested in your partner in general or sexually, right? This opens up to me just a vast realm of possibilities. And also seems, if one was to start to apply some of this, that at least in my experience, it's not just going to happen. it's like you kind of need a plan and someone that's on board, right? Like, hey, date night has taken on a new meaning, right? Let's commit to one another that we're going to explore this realm as you've described here. Because I find if there's not some sort of agreement or date set or a plan, then it's kind of like, oh, that sounded cool. Yeah, that interview was great. And someday, yeah, I would like to get into that. But then you get back into life and now your householding has overtaken your desire to recreate your own lowercase r rapture, So maybe what do you have in terms of, how one could actually start to develop the practice and commit and get buy-in from their partner, should they have one, on exploring some of this?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to, that there's so much rich, really profound content in what you were just pointing out, which is what happens in, let's say, long-term committed relationship, just as an example, right? It's the 21st century and everybody's consenting adults, so choose your relational format, right? Just be good to each other and honor your agreements to the best of your abilities, right? But that said, the notion of crawl, walk, run, like this is the equivalent of high altitude mountaineering. So you don't want half a dozen revolving semi-competent dance partners, right? You need somebody that's going to save your ass hanging from a portaledge in a 6-day storm, right?
Yeah.
So there is deep reason to, at the bare minimum, start with one dedicated partner, even if you have more expansionist aims or goals. And what it'll often do is it provides a profound source of, energy, vitality, pair bonding, connection. I mean, Helen Fisher, the Kinsey Institute researcher, she said there's no such thing as casual sex, right? Every time there's that neurochemical cascade and imprint wherever you are in the relationship arc, and you are being shaped and changed by this incredibly, right, evolutionary essential and neurophysiologically rich experience. So just putting more coins in the relationship bank account, you literally can learn to make love. You can generate the feelings of attraction, of affection, of trust, of safety, of passion, of inspiration, of awe. You can just tweak that shit. But once you realize you can make love, you don't have to go to your therapist to bitch and moan about why each of you isn't feeling like they've got enough of it. So that right there is game changing. And the simplest is, hey, question, partner, brushing teeth at night, would you be open if we explored for a fixed period of time, 28 days, 30 days, 6 months, a year, whatever it is for you, start small, give yourself the option to re-up versus let it die on the vine. And would you be open to committing to sexual fitness as practice on a regularly agreed upon cadence, whether we want to or not? Whether we want to or not.
That's the key, right? Because oftentimes some of the greatest sexual experiences are spontaneous, whether it's with a committed partner or otherwise. But those just seem so spontaneous. They just happen, right? You do it when you feel like it.
Yeah, or you're spitting bricks at each other. It's the last thing you feel like doing. And I'm still stuck in my old game of negotiating by withholding. I'm in a power spot saying no to intimacy, connection, et cetera, et cetera. And to drop that at the door and bow onto the mat, as it were, and be like, okay, we are showing up for our practice, hell or high water.
Yeah.
Right, the Australian tantric teacher Barry Long, he was a fascinating fellow, but he said something that is so jarring you can't unhear it, which he said, until you'd rather eat a shit sandwich than fuck your partner, you haven't even begun tantra. And you're like, damn, that's a high bar.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Yeah, but I think that key phrase there is whether you want to or not, right? Like I'm not a fitness guy. Like I just was not born with the gene that enjoys a high heart rate. Like when I work out.
I've never heard that. That seems so reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, I have this AI exercise bike and the oxygen contrast there, everything in the garage, and it's like there's probably $10,000 worth of gear down there. Which I just start my own gym and let other people use it, but I look at that thing and I'm just like, nah, not today. And it takes everything I've got to get out there. So But once I do, I do. And if I commit that I'm going to do it, I do it because I'm pretty good at holding commitments to myself. But it's the hurdle of like doing it whether I want to or not. And the thing that differentiates whether it happens or not is if I make a decision that it's going to happen at a specific time.
Well, there's also a pretty damn good Cracker Jack prize at the end of this one.
Yeah.
Way better than Peloton. High fives and emojis.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. I mean, let's not minimize, the value of a beautiful interaction with someone. But I think that's it, is that we're going to commit to this as a practice. Practice to me is the key word. That's the linchpin, I remember when I first started, meditating 25 years ago, I was like, oh, how do you make your mind stop? I was very misinformed about the purpose and technique of it at the time. But when the word practice was involved, then, so this is something that you're going to get better at, right? This is something that is going to be frustrating or difficult and maybe you don't want to do in the beginning. But over time, you build that muscle and you get better at it. It's like I have these guitars here, and I love that the way you talked about music in your book too. I won't get off on that, but I'm not trying to be in a band. Been there, done that. Couldn't make it, so stopped and did what I do now. Talk to artists and rather than trying to be one. But when I pick up those guitars, something really magical happens. Is that my brain changes, my body changes. I get creative. I get in a flow state. I mean, it's an incredible tool for me, and there's no goal. Yet I get better because it's a practice. It's not a practice of practicing guitar. It's a practice of taking myself into a state that I enjoy, right? Nice. And then the result of that is it takes less wherewithal for me to sit down and do it. And so the idea of actually, making a concerted effort to integrate sex practices into your life is incredible.
Yeah, well, and also just to be super clear, there's sort of two legs to this stool, or it's almost like a watershed, like a continental divide. You see those signs on mountain passes, and it's like that way, raindrop goes to the Pacific, that way it goes to the Atlantic, right? And so the first half of, let's just call it sexual fitness, is defragging our nervous systems and hard drives from micro to macro PTSD, right? So it's kind of healthful, right? Mm-hmm. But then the other half, as you become more capable and competent together, it can become full-on magical, mystical practice, revelatory. And, tend to not talk about that side of it simply because it can sound so ridiculous or sensational, or just, the spiritual marketplace is so trampled with hooey. You just don't want to go near it, right? But not to undersell, right? The fact that you can literally, you get the dials right in a very reproducible way with those combinations of interventions we've been, discussing briefly. And you can lob each other out of time and space, at least subjectively, experientially, into a place of profound epiphanic revelation, aka the ancient mysteries. So like we now have the neuroscience and psychology to map and track and explain what was arguably the seedbed of every initiatory mystical ecstatic state ever fucking created across this planet for 100,000 years. It's just now we know why this shit worked. And because we know why it works, we don't have to lead with mythologies, what it all means, what some old dude way back when said about it, right? We can just work with the technologies. What are the actual protocols, right? Evidence-based protocols that work. Now we've completely flipped all of religion on its head, right? Because all of religion was tops-down storytelling. This is what it means. This is what you should know or believe. This is bottoms-up experience design. So go see for yourself. Go check out the burning bush. Right? Like bow down in front of the Ark of the Covenant, right? And then you come back with your own insights and information. So that's what we mean about like, what could meaning 3.0 be?
And the open source requirement for meaning 3.0.
Exactly,
right?
Which is we're not going to suffer tops down solution by anybody at this point.
And that's why you're not sitting here in an orange robe, explaining to me how I can have a 12-hour erection if I sign up for your whatever,
Yeah. It's much more. Hey, this is human birthright stuff, and unintentionally, our sexuality causes, roughly half or 50% or more of our world grief, suffering, war, conflict, trauma, all these things. So you're like, holy shit! Can we untie the strings of an amoral evolution that doesn't give a fuck about us, just wants a robust gene pool? Can we then stand up ourselves and take responsibility for these very potent forces moving through our bodies, brains, hearts, minds, and lives, right? And then can we use it towards the project of healing, inspiration, and connection? And then can we let 1,000 fires burn right? We don't need tops-down monolithic structures. It's like everybody express your own art, your own truth, what is most reflective and supportive of your own community or your culture, right? And 999 of those experiments will probably get snuffed out in the storms ahead. Not everything's going to work. Not everything should work, right? But we are going to see, right, handfuls of brilliant innovations, right, from the most unlikely places, from the slums of Manila, right, or or the boondocks of Kansas, and those moments can catch, and then we can vote with our feet, with our hearts and our minds, right, and we can all adapt and adopt these as we go forward. So to me, it's a crowdsourced hackathon on Meaning 3.0, right, and what are postmodern, contemporary, open source expressions of our healing, believing, and belonging.
Awesome. Great. And that's a perfect segue into the next topic that I want to cover. For those listening, you can find the show notes at lukestory.com/rapture. Because we kind of breeze through some of the actual tools and mechanics around sexual practice. So I want people to know that everything you rattled off will be there in links to your book. And I think there's even some other resources outside of the actual book that give more detailed descriptions of like, what do you do, right? Okay, cool. So lukestory.com/ I can't say that word /rapture. Let's get into what you call ethical cult building. And I love that phrase because, as I was telling you earlier, I've been unknowingly and unwittingly in a couple cults.
What kind? What was their flavor?
Well, the first one was this boarding school that I was sent to in northern Idaho called Rocky Mountain Academy. And if anyone looks this shit up, I mean, it's crazy. I was a drug addict. I was having problems with police. So when I was 14, it was like you either go to juvenile detention center until you're 18, or you got to find somewhere to leave the state and get out of here. Go to a boarding
straight
school.
Up like Hoods in the Woods kind of situation.
Yeah, and it was. I could do a bunch of podcasts about this, but just to answer your question, it had many of the components of a cult because you were sequestered away from your family. You had to dress a certain way, cut your hair a certain way. There was charismatic leaders. It was
no way.
It was very expensive. There were custom linguistics around all of the teachings, unique language to it. If you left, they would send a bounty hunter after you that would then send you to a locked facility, mainly in Provo, Utah, a really famous kind of, pay for jail kind of thing for naughty kids. I didn't know it was a cult until a couple years ago, because the irony here and why I like the idea of ethical cults is I still did benefit tremendously. I mean, when I was discharged from there, although I unfortunately fell back into the clutches of addiction in a very profound way for another decade, I did stop breaking into people's houses and doing some of the more egregious criminal activity that had gotten me sent there in the first place. And also just, had an understanding of some of these. It was kind of based on a lot of this kind of early 80s pop psychology, experiential therapy stuff, pounding pillows and group therapy and just all this weird stuff, sleep deprivation, these workshops where they keep you up for 3 days and like nudge you to keep you awake. And it was like you were brainwashed.
It sounds almost like Werner Erhard-esque.
Yeah. A lot of that
Fritz
kind of stuff.
Kind of stuff.
The interesting thing is you weren't brainwashed into doing anything to serve the charismatic leader. You were brainwashed into having self-esteem and getting in touch with your inner child and stuff. So it was very convoluted in the sense that what you were being indoctrinated into was largely positive, but the methods and means by which they did so were completely unethical and fucking insane. And the facilitators and, quasi-therapists that were there teaching were often ex-cons and unlicensed and had no formal training whatsoever. In some cases, even kids that had graduated from the school and then became sort of ad hoc counselors. But it still ultimately was a positive experience in my life. And I'll do a podcast about it or something. But how I found out it was a cult is I was just researching. You get older, you go on Facebook, look for your old classmates. And so I went on and looked for it. And there are now like survivors of Rocky Mountain Academy groups and such.
Holy moly.
And I was like, survivor? I thought I was a graduate. And they're like, no, you're a survivor. And then I started to unpack some and go, holy shit, I was. So that was the first one. The second one was a couple years into my addiction recovery, I was in really bad shape and just completely lost at, 26 years old. Just my anesthesia had been removed and all the underlying trauma and mental and emotional issues were just festering, and I was just a fucking hot mess.
Wow.
So I came across a mentor at the time who, in terms of their understanding of spirituality and consciousness and addiction recovery, were like, Ram Dass, Eckhart Tolle, or whatever kind of quasi-enlightened person you could think of. So their level of understanding was much greater than mine, and they had a tremendous ability to help me and set me on the right course, but also had very abusive cult-like tendencies that sort of developed over the years that I was unaware of, again, until I had emerged and looked back and went, what the fuck was that? That was some really sick stuff. So my two experiences kind of in different cult dynamics were interesting because I still did derive a lot of benefit, but also endured a lot of abuse that I wasn't really aware of until it was all over looking back.
Yeah.
So I find the whole topic and trend of exposing cults and stuff right now really interesting, and I'm kind of continuing to learn about it. And I know you kind of, or I sense you kind of use the word, an ethical cult as a play on culture. So we're not actually talking about building a cult, but rather, how do we form groups of like-minded people that are doing this type of inner work that we're talking about today and that you explore in your book? How do we build community out of this and support one another, right? And so in so doing, as you've indicated, it's really important to look at what to avoid, right? Which is the, kind of the what to not do or what to look out for, which I felt like I had in my notes here. The fallen guru thing, the Lucifer effect, the things that are indicative of cults that many of us are unaware of and then fall prey to actually being in one.
Yeah.
Essentially. So the downside of it, maybe let's explore that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just like precision of terms, right? Because when we think of cult, we think of one very specific, quite recent subset, which is like the culty cult, the drink the Kool-Aid, helter-skelter cult, like Nexium, whatever we're watching on Netflix lately, right? Yeah. And that's actually an aberration, right? If scholars of religion talk about mystery cults all the time, cults of Kali, cults of Dionysus, cults of Jesus, right? Before Emperor Constantine, made it a state religion in the 4th century, right? So basically small communities of practice around a, again, repeatable, quite often lineage or persistent ecstatic or initiatory experience. Those would be mystery cults, and they've been ubiquitous around the world and have been vibrant and healthy for thousands of years. And the sort of promise was like, hey, you as a potential, user or consumer, right? You have to subjugate yourself to this experience, to this lineage, to this community. But who's leading you, right, is buffered by lineage, right? It's one person in the role today or this 10 years, but they answer to a council, they answer to their ancestors.
Like the Dalai Lama.
There's precedent,
right? Yeah.
Right? There's precedent that is actually a buffer between two people in a mind fuck, right? So that went on for a really long time. And then we kind of get 20th century, we got this merging of East and West, travel, exchange of ideas, to everything from Tibetan, basically Buddhism and Hinduism making their way to the West. And then you had this rise of originally Eastern teachers, and then quick on their heels, Western imitators, but originally Eastern teachers like Chogyam Trungpa and others who, in some ways, declared a break with their lineage. Right, the Osho was another example of that. Right, like the idea of like, yes, I might have come up this way, but I'm now no longer subject to their critiques or signing off on all of their checklists. I'm my own thing. So now the user had to subjugate themselves, but not to a lineage, right? To an individual self-proclaimed God-man or woman realizer. And then that obviously is where the wheels go wildly off the track, right? And then the final one would be, okay, what might an ethical cult look like? So back to the original definition, a community of practice or worship, right? That doesn't require subjugation of self to anybody. In fact, that honors the individual autonomy and sovereignty of each individual, but at the same time allows for healthy merging with the collective for the for the healing, inspiration, and connection that can provide. Can we do that? So can we honor the individual instead of subjugating them? And can we actually get better at merging with each other without tripping over our dicks or stepping on each other's toes?
And maybe insulate it so that it has some longevity too, right?
Yeah.
So that it doesn't cannibalize itself.
So they're not so volatile.
Because so many of these movements have come out and it's like, oh, it's great at first, then it goes off the rails,
exactly.
right?
They all start out awesome. It's like Boogie Nights.
Yeah. So what are some of the, I guess, what to look for? I know where the what not to do. I marked it in your book. I was like, why isn't it in my notes? It's right there. But I don't want to get too laborious on it. But there are certain things. I mentioned the charismatic leader. You're talking about the requirement to surrender your sovereignty and oftentimes wealth. And I think that it's tough for some of us, based again on my experience, to see when we're falling into one of the more negative cults, because it's often dressed up with something, that appears to be more wholesome. And we're also getting value out of it, right? I mean, if you think about the charismatic leader, let's, take the guru that's able to transmit the Shaktipat to you in darshan. And I mean, you feel it and it's real and you have a healing or realizations. And then, you fall for the trap of, putting that power on them as an individual rather than just having that be a natural spiritual phenomenon that just happened to be in the presence of this person, So what are some of the trappings of the negative side of a cult that we could look for and hopefully avoid?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole, I think, 9 punch list, like culty cult checklist that's in the book, and it's also on the website. So you can check it if you want to kind of get into the weeds.
Oh, cool. Okay, cool.
And at the same time, the handful that, to me, are like deal breakers, like just blaring
That's
red
what I
signs. And if you see that, they're almost irretrievable. I've never seen somebody fuck it up that way and then still turn out to be a good egg.
Okay, give me the red flags. That's a much shorter way to ask the question I'm looking for an answer to.
So the soft entry, the thing to notice on the front door is mythologized origin story of the founder. Right? If they have a just so story where either they were composing Mozart by age 3, or they asked their parents or their teacher, in the cradle, what is really life about, mommy? Any kind of like early talent as signpost to future destiny.
Or they could read some complex scriptures when they were 4.
Yep. Or past life recall, you name it. Fill in the blank for what the juju is, but they're taking the claim preemptively.
Yeah, that's good.
And then, or right, the opposite. Right, the Damascene Paul and Saul on the road to Damascus. Right, you can. The alternate is, I was a miserable son of a bitch. In fact, let me just regale you with how awful I actually was. Right, I was broke. I was a hedge fund cokehead. I was a womanizer. I was whatever. And then I had my epiphany. Right, and now I've come back with the good news to preach and teach. So either of those, we have ample little story buckets in our brains for either of them. We love them both. That's step 1 warning sign. If anybody's doing that shit these days, they should almost just be disqualified out of the gates.
The second one's interesting though, because so many people, and I would like to consider myself in this category, have their pain to purpose story. Yes. I guess it's what you try and do with that story, right? And if you try to indoctrinate people into it, but anyone that I've met, and I would say the vast majority of people I've interviewed that are doing something very meaningful in the world have suffered tremendously, and they found a way up and out, and they're here to tell you the good news and maybe illustrate a roadmap. I mean, that's kind of really awesome. People tend to have that. So
yes, well, here's the final bit.
Okay.
Right? So this is the extra filter, because I think we often encourage people, like, if you want to know what to do in the world, aka your purpose, like look for the intersection of your talent and your trauma. Yeah. Like, where have you felt most acutely the wound of the world? And where do you have asymmetrical leverage to do something good about it? Right. And that's a decent way, to find our ways into that. But the third bit will really shed light on the second one.
Okay.
Which is absolutist claims of attainment.
Like, I'm the only one that has the answer for how I got myself out of that predicament.
So if the pain to purpose story is ongoing and human and humble, right? This is what's happened in my life. This is how I got to now, and I'm keeping going with the same humility, learning, attention to healing, whatever, revision, whatever it would be. Awesome. That's our lives. honestly told. If it becomes cast in amber with, spotlights, and it becomes reified, it becomes turned into a thing, and then it becomes justification for all my other subsequent truth claims. This is the key, right? So if I claim that I am unilaterally enlightened, what I've done is I've just dropped the steel gate between me and my humanity and my accountability ever again. I'm perfect.
Mm-hmm.
If enlightenment equals perfection in my fuzzy thinking, and
Yeah.
you're now contaminated belief,
Yeah.
right? Now, any wonky shit that happens between me and you or in our community that you notice, sense, think, feel, perceive, or dare bring up to me cannot be coming from that enlightened, perfected being.
It's your shit.
So then I do the whammy.
That's going to breed projection.
You're
right?
projecting your shit onto me. And they're like, no, okay. So they go back and they think about that. They're like, okay, how do I re-sift and scan for all my own unconscious biases? This is a guru. This is a light bringer. They've got to have a point. They've got to have insights I can't have myself. That's why I'm here after all. So that'll settle them for another 3 to 6 months. And then they're like, wait a second. You can't, you catch them red-handed, like fucking doing poppers and banging your wife. And you're like, wait a second, bro. That is definitely on you. That was not my fucking shadow projection. It's like, you just did a shitty thing.
Yeah.
And then they're like, well, here's my back pocket that'll get me out of all my get out of jail cards, which is, that was crazy wisdom, bro. I was doing that whack ass shit for your benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the moment you have any of those, you're stuffed.
Yeah.
And then the sort of the kind of final one to really, really notice, it's a bit of a subset, but it kind of comes together. Number one is emphasis on feeling versus thinking. So you massively de-emphasize or outright persecute cognition, discernment, evidence, reason,
asking questions,
yeah. And you emphasize somatic experience, sensation, feeling, and quite often get out of your head, get into your heart, like that kind of avenue. So if anybody is questioning or connecting dots or asking those questions, right? And then the final one is the kind of weaponized use of peak states or vulnerable healing, right? To then either get money, get atonement, right? Get compliance, get obedience, get adulation. So I'm now boundaries dropped or dissolved, right? So I'm not able to give full consent.
As a participant in this ecstatic experience.
Either in a peak state or a cathartic healing experience. Think about one of those stay up all night, encounter sessions.
Yeah.
And at some point you break down and you're racked with sobs and you're feeling the thing.
Oh yeah.
And then they do the jujitsu, the sort of epistemological juju of being like, well, what you're feeling right now is true, isn't it? Right? And remember we said, don't think, just feel. So the feeling is more true. And then what we'll do is we'll now cobble on to our entire cosmology is what that meant. It could be that you're purging sin. It could be that you're wrestling with entities. It could be that you're, metabolizing your psychic trauma, whatever. Tell just so story unchecked. But because the visceral truth of what you're experiencing right now, snot is coming out of my nose. I am racked with sobs. This did happen with us all here together doing the thing, right? Therefore, all of our other truth claims are universally and unilaterally true also. And we will extract concession, money, right? Sign over my trust fund or my social security checks, right? Allegiance.
Or run to the back of the room and sign up for our next course.
Atonement, permissions, upsells, whatever it would be, right? And so if you just, those, like I think we've just ID'd like 4 things.
Yeah.
And you almost never need to go past those. It's not even like it's not even like the sociopaths are especially stealthy these days. They're brazen and they're operating in broad daylight and instantly scannable on TikTok and Instagram.
Wow. All right.
Staggering.
I got what I wanted. That's great. Now on to the idea of an ethical cult, and you offer a toolbox to include metaphysics, ethics, and sacraments.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm going to throw in one more thing because it was just so beautiful. And I've heard this story before, but you talk about Aldous Huxley's last words. He took, a couple hits of LSD and said to his wife, "Above all, be kind." I mean, that's the takeaway, and that's your insurance, provided you're not a delusional leader or cult leader, right? But what are some of the kind of components of building community or whatever we want to call it that would prevent it from falling into the category that we just sort of covered?
Well, I mean, for a long time, because again, you talked about like all the podcasts and things that are sort of cult hunters these days. And some are interesting. Some I think are getting captured by their own sort of queer eye for the cult guy snock.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So they just become sort of bitchy takedowns.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. By people that have not built anything themselves oftentimes.
Yeah, but within that world,
Well, there's a lot of envy in there too.
yeah,
So,
cloud chasing and all sorts of things, right? But to your point, where you said, "Hey, I think I might have been into kind of culty communities or organizations, but I got a lot of good things out of them."
Yeah.
Nevertheless, that position is actually very controversial within the cult busting community.
Yes.
Because you often get what they would experience as still quasi or semi brainwashed folks rationalizing or explaining some of the atrocities, the child abuse, the sexual stuff, the substance, whatever it would be, because they got the Kensho, because they got the Shaktipat, right?
Yeah.
And so that doesn't solve it, but that's just to say that's a lot of the water they're swimming in. But another bit of the water they're swimming in is generally, as a conclusion from that first commitment, there is no such thing as good to explain all the horrors, is that there was no there. There is no such thing as Shaktipat. There is no such thing as charismatic transmission. There is no such thing as state change and field
and no such
experiences.
thing as a truly enlightened being that does have the ability to transmit healing, love, etc.
Any number of things.
Because I've experienced that myself.
Who would you identify in that way?
David Hawkins, a teacher that I used to go see speak in Sedona. He's not a very Sedona type guy. He's now passed, but just being in the energy field of that room. It's not even about him per se. It's the field of consciousness that's cultivated within that, and where you're having spontaneous realizations and healing and unraveling, thought forms that are no longer serving you and things like that. Just being in the room. My first one, I was around 8 years old, and my mom took me to the ashram of Muktananda, who had an ashram in Oakland at the time in the late 70s. And even at that age, being in that room, I would say that was one of the most meaningful experiences in my life, and I believe truly set me on a course to further pursue that sort of Eastern mysticism and, eventually get into all the Vedic meditation, Kundalini yoga, just always leaning kind of toward that kind of philosophy. But there was something visceral that was taking place in that room, even at 8 years old, and I didn't have to have an intellectual understanding of what was happening. That being had something going on that was undeniable, which could be, of course, proven by the fact that you've got a couple hundred people sitting there just wanting to hear the next word come out of his mouth. As far as I know, he wasn't one of the baddies, that turned it into some sort of exploitive, relationship with his devotees or anything. But I've had multiple experiences like that where I just know, I felt one way, I'm in this being's presence and I feel different. And it's a better different.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So I'm willing to put a sort of provisional pin in the map in defense that there are exceptional humans who can have an outsized impact in a group of other humans. And whether that's with a guitar or with a microphone or with no words or with beautiful words, right? Just to allow that there's the exceptionality of charismatic transmission. And it's presumably a thing because it's kind of how we've organized around teachers and artists and everyone for a long, long time. So given that, for a long time, I assume that if you did end up with cultic dynamics, the cultic dynamics of the sex, drugs, power, ego, distortion, whatever it would be, that was sign that there was a rot in the apple barrel, right? Pretty obviously, like, oh, they fucked up, like they did something bad or wrong. And then I really came to study it more with Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's a neuroscientist who does work on emotions and feelings. And her big insight was there's interoception, like literally our guts. There's perception and there's interoception. And it precedes all of our emotions. And it's just one of four things. It's active or passive, and it's positive or negative. So you can have an active positive, right? And then when I realized, I was like, oh, wow. You get that profound charismatic transmitter or teacher or whatever they would be, artist, and people feel different in their presence. And it's going to activate their nervous system down at the level of interoceptive guts, visceral spidey senses. And it's going to be one of those four outcomes. And I was like, oh shit, this maps perfectly. This is really interesting. So you come up with a realizer, let's say, somebody who can bring someone else into a more expanded state than they can harness or access themselves, right? They're going to want to do one of four things to that person, right? If it's passive positive, like I just had that state experience, I want to stay more, I want to sign up for the next workshop, you want to follow them. If it's super active positive, right? Yeah, I want to merge with them. I want to love them. I want to project on them. I might even want to fuck them. Right, which is why there's also so many scandals in evangelical churches and everything else, because the Holy Ghost feeling, right, is tough to keep in your pants, right?
Yeah.
You got to put it someplace, right?
Yeah.
And so there's the follow or the fuck, and then if it goes negative, it goes below the equator into some kind of reactivity or fear base. The first thing would be to fear them. I need to recoil. They're up in my business. They're telling me about, I'm going to have to let go. This is uncertain. I don't know what's happening. I feel like I'm in deeper water than I've ever been in. So I fear them. And then if you get either really you're back up against the wall or you get a mob, then we go to fight them. So the fear, fuck, follow, fight, right, seems to be the default for everybody from Malcolm X to MLK to Jerry Garcia to Osho to Gandhi to, you name it, right, to many of the fakes as well, right? So we see that as an anthropological feature of a group of humans connecting into shared space or communitas or group flow, whatever we would say, and the one who connected the circuit, the monkey, the silverback that connected the circuit. So we are hardwired to project our golden shadows onto them. They are amazing. They're all these things, which is fundamentally disempowering.
And isn't necessarily the fault of the leader, right? If they're a leader that's in integrity and are legitimately capable of transmitting, positive attributes to their people, and the people go fucking haywire in the way you just described, it's not necessarily the leader's fault.
Didn't have to be.
Unless they have some sort of, ethical cult system in place that prevents that from happening.
Yeah, but let's just give Jesus the fucking mulligan and say, you nailed it, bro. And he still gets betrayed. There's still, the fear, fight, follow, fuck brings that house down too. So you're like, okay, so very few teachers can enter that reality distortion field and the power dynamics and differentials and not get bent over time. Right? Yeah. But even the ones who are at least theoretically impeccable, those are features, not bugs, right, of humans in collective waking up or experiencing peak states and boundary dissolving healing in community or socialized with others. So that was my big insight, was like, oh, this is a feature, not a bug. Therefore, you can't just wag your finger at everybody who puts it in the ditch. You have to be like, oh no, this shit's structural. We have to solve for it at a structural level. And so for me, the key to an ethical culture where we help each other heal, right, receive inspiration and connect, right, would be is that no one grabs the ring of power, right? So that so you just don't do that, right? Because you know how problematic it is. And if it gets looped through a single ego identity and or incentive structures, including economic, sexual, egotistical power, whatever it would be, it's going to warp and bend. And there's been those MRI studies on power corrupting brain function, like literally mappable on MRI's brain function. The more power somebody has, the less empathetic they become. So that's literally a recent kind of structural insight. So then you're like, okay, now how do we treat? Somebody's got to know what's going on. Somebody's got to lead the band, right? For us to play this beautiful music no one's played yet. So the question there is, you can almost, you buffer it by creating roles, right? Rotating roles. So the person up front isn't Tony Robbins Inc., right? That's going to go to someone's head, even if he's got a big one, right? But it is to say, right, you create hierophants or ministers of the sacred. And ideally, you could even do a man and a woman every time. They could be in costume or garb. They could all the way up to, wearing masks, or it's just rotating cast and faculty. Because, no one goes Fatal Attraction or fanboys the ringleader at Cirque du Soleil.
Right.
They're like, you put on a top hat, you got those funny tails, you have the bullwhip, you do the thing. We know you're playing a role, emceeing this thing, right? So how do we create that instead of celebrity hype priests, right? Instead of personal growth gurus? And you literally have a community of facilitators, and you rotate on and off stage. And like someone comes off stage having just booted everybody up into ecstatic, joyful communion. And you're like, that's great. High fives, hugs. Thank you for your service. Smack, smack. You're not that special cupcake. Head back to the kitchen and go peel some potatoes, right? Like you almost have like a Geiger counter, right? For projection. And you're like, ding, 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 ding. You're overclocked right now, right? So you need to go and cool your jets. You need to put your hands in the soil. You need to submit yourself to service. And that way we would have a chance, I think, of both bringing in more juice without it being at risk of destabilizing our projects, which often happens, right? Which intentional community hasn't gone down for one or more of the above of sex, drugs, money, power, right? And there's a
Yeah.
reason that all monastic traditions around the world, time immemorial, have vows. Like you don't even get in the front door, right? Until you promise poverty, chastity, humility, and obedience, right? Because money, sex, power, right, and control, right, are the things that grab us. So we have to kind of become more creative in how we structure, how we architect our culture, right, so that it can be ethical. Because I think the fool's errand is for someone to go, oh yeah, all those other folks put it in the ditch in that spot, not me or not us.
Yeah.
Right, we're
Yeah.
smarter. They all said that.
Yeah.
Right. So I
Yeah.
think we have to just pan back and go, well, wait, what if this is gravity that's happening? And if so, what are the social physics? Right.
Because even the fallen guru who did possess a certain degree of understanding or power, call it what you will, was good for a period of time, right? And then that inertia of, just the ego maybe co-opting the powers that they had or something like that, right? Thinking of Satya Sai Baba in India, who by all historical and I think accurate accounts had the ability to manifest physical objects out of thin air, vibhuti and rings and things like that, right? And it's widely known that, thousands and thousands of people directly saw him do this. But then at a certain point, the story goes, and I believe it's pretty accurate. I spent some time over there and know a bit about the inner workings of it. At a certain time, he lost the ability to do this and then started doing it as a magic trick and got caught later on. But there's all this footage and stuff where you see him like pre-deep fake. I mean, just poof, that thing's there. It wasn't there. My own family members sat this far away from him and watched it happen. I think that's why I know they're not liars and I know they're not crazy. But then he lost the power and started faking it. And then rumor has it that also started behaving very inappropriately sexually. And I don't know if that's true or not, but he's definitely like a shunned, really famous guru. But it's like the person at the front would then be protected from that happening to them. Because you don't, like you said, you don't think that's going to happen. If I became the charismatic leader, I think I'm a humble guy. I'm always working on myself. I never think I've arrived. Like,
yeah, but I mean, think about how many folks we know that do podcasts or have, big Twitter followings or Patreon, and they get captured literally just being a sort of rebel public intellectual over the last 3, 4, 5 years, right? They started out being thoughtful and considered, and people started following them, and then they went down the fucking rabbit hole.
Yeah, they got an agent.
Yeah, and whether it's, Great Reset or ivermectin or take your pick, you're like, oh no, bro, come back, and they're gone.
Yeah,
they're gone because the echo chamber and the incentive structures of their little world are consistently bending them to double down on the thing that has worked. Yeah. And so my sense is, because that question for me kind of goes back to the heart of like the comparative religious study of cultic behavior over centuries. I was like, why did so many start out so well?
Yeah.
And how do they end up all seemingly so predictably go bad in the end? And my insight or hypothesis is that it is the Lucifer effect, which you mentioned earlier, which is just that idea of someone can start out being an exceptional human, right? Spiritual, emotional intelligence, prodigious insights, maybe sort of an accidental mystic having access to all kinds of inspiration that they draw from to bring through new stuff. You'd be like, wow, they're just firing on all cylinders. That's amazing. And their early efforts grow these blossoming, vibrant, dynamic communities. And then there gets to be a place where they are now so luminescent, right? They're bringing so much metaphorical or charismatic light, right? That everybody around them has to kind of shield their eyes. And the Lucifer moment is when that person either says or embodies the notion of like, dare thee to look upon me and spot my imperfection, right? The people shield themselves from this almost angelic presence. And they're like, oh my gosh, you're all of these things that we could never be. And then that person has divorced themselves from their vulnerability, from their mortality, from their humanity. And then they can be 99% light with just 1 tiny percent left. I mean, that's a spectacular being, right? 1% shadow remaining. But then because they've invoked that Lucifer effect, then that last little speck of darkness metastasizes and you have a Sith Lord in a few months.
Right.
You got Kurtz up the
Right.
river. You got Brando in Apocalypse Now. You're like, what the fuck? He was a decorated right officer.
Yeah.
And so that, right? How do we, and so what's the antidote to that? Isn't, if we're just going to stay in the idiom of the Judeo-Christian tradition, like the opposite of the Luciferian, which is dare thee to look upon me and spot my imperfection, is take out the nails, remove the thorns, put your hand in my side, right? The Christic pledge, which is, it is precisely my mortality, right? Plus my divinity that brings me to my humanity. And I am forever a work in progress. I am forever, right? There ain't no saint without a past or sinner without a future.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'm simply bearing witness to this, my own, and all of our lived experience.
I really love all of that. And especially going back to the model that you were kind of outlining earlier of a leadership-less group, right? And it brought to mind, or at least some sort of system that keeps people in check, like more of a collective. And it brought to mind one of the most sustainable and effective groups, which is the original Alcoholics Anonymous, which is then, of course, blossomed into all these other groups, and is seemingly, that was founded in 1935, is seemingly uncorruptible. And I've observed that as someone who benefited tremendously from just that teachings and that model. And, I'm sure it has its faults and is going to evolve, but are you aware of what they call the 12 traditions in Alcoholics Anonymous?
It's different than the steps?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna break something down because I think it's shocking to me that no one has adopted these traditions when seeking to organize something as fundamental organizing principles of an ethical culture or group. So the steps are for the individual, right? These are spiritual principles, just well-worn and tested throughout the ages. And if you apply these things to your life, you'll likely be a more fulfilled, healthier person. And as a result, probably won't start drinking again, right? But the traditions are for the actual groups and the organization itself. And I've always been fascinated by this because it's kept that organization insulated from corruption or from anyone taking over. And it's still thriving and it doesn't own anything. It doesn't make any money. No one's in charge of it. And the way that it's able to function and still continue to help millions and millions of people around the world is this group of traditions that, like in your book, you outlined as suggestions, not commandments. And so this is read in almost every 12-step meeting you could ever go to. And it's the organizing principles that keep it from going off the fucking rails.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, you want to check it out?
Yeah.
All right. It's a bit long. We don't have to go into it, but
you can just headline each one.
I thought of that as from reading your book and going into this piece, and I was like, oh shit, someone's already done it. Number one, our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends on AA unity, the common welfare, right? For our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God, as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. And it's like, if nobody's governing this organization that you call AA and all the other groups, how the fuck is it still here? It's crazy. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. So welcome to everyone. Each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. So your little group can do whatever you want unless it fucks up what everyone else is doing. Each group has but one primary purpose, to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. An AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. So it doesn't get involved with anything else. It's just its own secular little bubble. Every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. So if I wanted to, as a philanthropist, for example, leave my $1 billion inheritance to Alcoholics Anonymous, they would say no. It's insane. Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional, but our service centers may employ special workers. So we're not going to build a company.
Although that is interesting because there's a shit pile of even court-mandated 12-step recovery centers that are 100% piggybacking on the norms of AA and are monetizing the hell out of recovery.
Yeah, they're privately owned,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. I mean, this is a whole but see, this isn't the organization itself,
Yes.
right? You have people that are incentivized, I'm sure, to help people, but also to make money, making recovery centers and sober living houses and all this kind of stuff. And what's funny, there's a joke in recovery, like, yeah, I went to rehab, I bought a $30,000 big book, which is the book of Alcoholics Anonymous, because all they really do in most rehabs is just teach you how to go to AA, Okay, furthermore, AA as such ought never be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. This is a good one here, number 10. I didn't enumerate them, but anyone can look them up. And again, I'm not trying to like be a cheerleader for AA, although I am.
No, we're discussing open source culture architecture, around healing and community.
Exactly.
So yeah.
And I'm like, if this model worked, why aren't more people following it? Number 10, Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues. Hence, the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. And so you don't have AA going, we're going to make our meetings, non-binary or whatever.
Like message discipline.
Yeah, it's just, nope, anything happening in the world, we're not addressing. This is for, a group to serve the individual, essentially. Our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. Now, many people, unfortunately, because this is not a commandment or a rule, but a tradition, many people in the public eye break this. And I always find that to be a little sad. Where an actor
they
goes
out themselves,
yeah,
or they out other people?
An actor goes on TV and is like, well, I went to rehab and now I go to AA, and then next month they crash their car and kill an old lady in a wheelchair, and people think, well, AA doesn't work, right? So I always get a little bit miffed when people do that, and I've had to find ways. I'm not a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, but I have benefited tremendously in the past from those teachings. But that one's really interesting there. And, I think most people are pretty respectful about that, but some didn't catch this. And it's not a rule. Last one, number 12. Anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all of our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities, which is beautiful because, again, there's no leader. Everyone's a trusted servant. So if you, me and my friends, hey, we want to start our own meeting, and we go do our thing, you have secretaries, you have the treasurer, you have people that volunteer that don't get paid to help kind of support the infrastructure, but none of them would ever have the ability to rise to any power, have any control over anyone else. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's neat. That sounds like a really good set
Isn't
of
that
checks
wild?
and balances.
Yeah, it's wild. Here, you can have it.
Nice.
So yeah, I just thought of that when reading your book, and I thought, man, there is a model. I don't know if that is the model, but there's certainly things in there that have proven over time, at least since 1935, to insulate a group of people with an intended purpose from corruption, abuse, exploitation. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and then the simplest TLDR of a bunch of that was don't get sucked into tribal power politics and stay the fuck out of markets and media.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Which is, again, the opposite of TikTok, Instagram, self-help marketplace.
Right.
Or mega churches. Right, or any of the things that are sort of our seeming alternate options these days.
Yeah, and don't amass wealth.
Yeah.
Always, it's like the way that this thing operates, it's always just paying for itself, and there's very little reserves. There's enough reserves so that it lasts through hard times, but it doesn't amass wealth over time that someone can then co-opt to gain control and steer it in another direction.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to me.
It's beautiful.
Hot damn, dude. Well, I think we did it. Wow. God, I can't believe we covered just about everything I wanted to cover. I still feel like we go back and do another 4 episodes and parse out some of the things in the book that I just schemed over, like, respiration, music, some of these other amazing tools. But man, thank you so much for, having the mind that you do and the heart that you do and contributing the books that you create and this conversation, man. It's been really illuminating for me.
Stoked to be here, man. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. Last question is, who have been 3 teachers or teachings that have influenced your life or your work that you could share with us?
Beautiful. That's so fun. I would say probably, there's a bunch. On the mama wisdom, it would probably be Pema Chodron and Alice Walker. Maybe and Joanna Macy. Let's kind of make it that hat trick. On the kind of crazy uncles, it would be Ken Kesey, Robert Anton Wilson, And I mean, we could throw in John Lilly. And then as far as like true role models that I aspire to would be Gary Snyder, George Leonard, and maybe Paul Newman.
Wow. Oh, I got to show you something when we're done recording. You're going to love this. You cite John Lilly a few times in your book, and I don't know that much about him. And some of the names you named, I know, and some I don't. We'll put them in the show notes. But John Lilly was the cat that kind of either invented or made popular sensory deprivation chambers, right?
Yep.
Kind of in an effort to induce a psychedelic experience without having to actually ingest anything.
Well, though, no, he started out ingesting shit piles of everything, including like pharmaceutical
in the chambers,
in the tanks.
Oh my god!
So if you've ever seen that movie Altered States,
yeah. Oh yeah.
Dude, that's a variant of his life story.
Okay.
So yeah. I mean, he built the sensory deprivation tanks, had one at Esalen, had one in a few other places, and was doing high dose LSD experiments for as long as it was research grade legal. He was a University of Penn, NIH researcher, impeccably trained, rigorous dude, and got way down the rabbit hole in that space. And then when LSD was scheduled and then no longer available as a research material, he moved to ketamine and basically started sort of deep diving into some totally parallel universe, matrix-like reality with hierarchies and different characters and agents. He became super convinced that there was a silicon state, like almost like the Borgs or Skynet. He was like, there's a solid state intelligence that is actually an intelligent entity in the universe that is coming to take over the world. It's going to trigger nuclear or thermonuclear war. And he needs to get in touch with President Ford to let him know that that's going on. And he's connected enough. He comes from a high-end family plus his academic credentials. He gets fucking through to the White House, right? So he gets through to the White House. Some of his peers and colleagues are institutionalizing him, but he's again so connected and so persuasive that he gets out of the loony bin multiple times. And then he ends up overclocking. Basically, he's flying to land at LAX in a plane. This comet flashes by the window. He has this unstuck in time experience where the comet is basically saying, we are solid state intelligence and we control the entire grid, et cetera. And he's like, yeah, prove it to me. And then there's this lot of turbulence. All the lights go out in LA and they're like, we're diverting. LAX has just had a power outage. We're going to have to emergency land in Burbank. And that's when he's like way into the pudding.
What?
Yeah. So yes, John Lilly. And then he got into dolphins. And so I dismissed him early because all I heard was float tanks, acid, and talking to dolphins. I'm like, you're a fruit. Like, I'm not going to bother. And it was only coming back later that I was like, oh, wow. He was actually surprisingly on it and rigorous in his passing of the misto, right? He did it with academic discipline, et cetera. And so, his famous quote is, what one believes to be true becomes true. Within the limits of reality, within the province of the mind, there are no limits. So he was basically creating this kind of provisional epistemology of how do you make sense of these highly fluid, plastic, ridiculous, non-ordinary spaces, and do it within some form of checklist or set of mental rules that prevents you from totally losing your mind. And he came, I think, as close as anybody, because he sailed right to the edge of the screaming abyss and stayed there for 5 to 10 years, and just made it back by the skin of his teeth.
Oh my God, that's fascinating! What a trip! I got to learn more about this guy. I just kind of hear about him in the periphery, but hadn't looked into it.
Yeah, but Robert Anton Wilson, right? I mean, he's the precursor to all of QAnon, funnily enough. Like, he was an editor at Playboy in the mid-'70s, and just for shits and grins, like just as a prank, they had all these letters to the editor, and they're like, these guys are all nuts. Let's see what they can do. So they put together the arch meta-conspiracy. It was called the Illuminatus conspiracy. People have read the book. It's kind of an underground classic. And it was all the conspiracies, like the Bavarian Illuminati, Einstein, JFK assassination. It was all of them glommed together, and they did it as a prank. Published it in the
Really?
letters to Playboy, right? They took a fake pen name and pretended that, and then they ended up writing this book, and he said for like 2 years, even though we did it as a joke, and we were 100% the authors and creators of this ludicrous mashup, A, nobody else got it. They all took it dead seriously. And B, shit started getting real and happening to us also.
Oh, wow.
So that's where he articulates this notion of reality tunnels, right? And the Chapel Perilous of what happens when you get into a perspectival hyper possibility space. And how do you navigate all that? without getting lost in a given reality tunnel, just a new, different description of the way that reality works. And he said basically the chapel perilous is that sort of hall of mirrors of peak contemplative, ecstatic, psychedelic states, fill in your blank. And he goes, no one, basically anyone who enters the chapel perilous leaves one of two things, insane or agnostic.
Holy shit.
Right? So that
Wow.
agnosticism, that kind of playful trickster, don't take it or yourself too seriously, right, is a really central, I think, touchstone for me as far as how to hold any of these contemplations or experiences.
Yeah, I sense that about you because you're covering really heavy topics, but there's definitely an air of playfulness to it, which I think is why I gravitate toward it. If your book was too serious and you were too serious, it would be
butt shave.
Yeah, it wouldn't be too fun. So thank you, man. Thanks again for joining me today.
Yeah.